Welcome to the Connect Your Health to Life coaching podcast. I'm your host, Seth Lusk. I'm a master certified self-image coach and empowered health coach with a decade-long background working in the health and wellness industry. If you're anything like me or the clients that I work with, then you're probably struggling with body image, self-image, or confidence issues. You're probably also trying to figure out why it is that you have these amazing desires for living your healthiest and most fulfilling life, but you can't seem to create consistent actions in your life to reflect those desires. So join me as we dive in deep on what it means to live a fulfilled and authentic life. We're going to look from the perspective of an empowered mindset and uncover reasons why you might be what's holding yourself back from living your most fulfilling life. I'm going to break through some of the biggest illusions and myths that we've all been taught to believe along the way. And I'm so excited to have you with me on this journey. So my only question for you is, are you ready to start living your most authentic and fulfilling life once and for all? Then let's get started, shall we? Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast. For those of you listening in for the first time, welcome. So I've got yet another interesting topic for you all today. Before I jump in, I just want to note two things. I'm doing two things differently this week on the podcast. Number one, I'm releasing this on Thursday instead of Wednesday. And so by the time I put this episode out, it will be Thursday morning here in Switzerland, and I believe it will be Wednesday night or late at night in the US. Whereas before I was releasing it late night Tuesday in the US and early morning Wednesday here in Switzerland. So that is changing. This has to do with some analytics that I was receiving back from my podcast host provider, letting me know that switching to a different day may actually increase my audience representation or exposure for the podcast. So we're switching to Thursdays as sort of a test to see what happens. I will let you all know after a few weeks of trying this out on Thursday whether or not we will stick with Thursday or go back to Wednesday or maybe even try a different day. But I'm thinking it will probably end up staying on Thursday, but we may end up going back to Wednesday. I will let you know. I'm also trying something else, a little bit new on the podcast this week, and I'm not going to tell you what it is, but I would love if you listen in on this week's podcast episode to let me know in the comments section, or you can always drop me a line on Instagram or Facebook or send me an email. All of the links for my Instagram and Facebook and as well as my website are going to be in the description of the podcast. So you can find me there. And if you go to my website, you can find my email address. So all ways to contact me in the description. But if you're listening in this week and you notice a difference in how you feel about listening to the podcast, relate to the content of the podcast or the way I'm presenting it, let me know. I'm not going to tell you exactly what I'm doing differently, but I am doing something differently this week, and I want to see how you all relate to it. So feedback is very much appreciated on this one. So just listen in, see if you notice anything different, and if you like it or you don't, as opposed to the episodes that I've been doing for the last 4 or 5 months now. So today's topic, my friends, it's huge. And I struggled so much over the last, me and my, one of my content managers started working on this topic several weeks ago. And we kept putting it off on putting it into a podcast episode because it was just like, there's so much to talk about here. It was a struggle for us to decide which direction do we want to take this? How do we want to talk about it? How do we want to present it? How do we want to make sure that we, represent all of the misinformation and clarify everything? So we're talking about narcissism this week. And the reason why I want to talk about narcissism is because, well, there are many reasons, but the biggest reasons why, number one, is that we live in a world now where I would say a good 80% of the population is struggling with forms of narcissism. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm saying that 80% of the population of the world has narcissistic personality disorder. That's something different, and we'll talk about that. But there are aspects of narcissism that have become very prevalent in our society in the 21st century. And so many people are struggling with facets of narcissism and how they see other people struggling with narcissism, how they're struggling with narcissism, in people's ability to see their own struggles with narcissism, and people's ability to understand other people's struggle with narcissism. So that's one of the reasons why I want to talk about it today. The other reason I really want to talk about it today is because there is so much misinformation going out there on the topic of narcissism, and it's because it is such a huge topic. And even in the realm of psychology, we're talking like people with doctorates in psychology, people that have been practicing psychology and doing research on psychology, it is a controversial topic. And there is new research coming out that is contradicting old research and leading the psychology community into a different direction at looking at narcissism. And actually, in the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic Manual for Mental Illnesses, basically, they completely changed the description and diagnostic criteria for narcissism from the DSM-4. And what that says to me is that the psychology community has recognized that the way that narcissism has been looked at, diagnosed, and treated, they're now recognizing wasn't serving us. It was misdiagnosing people, it was underdiagnosing people, overdiagnosing other people, and it was looking at some aspects of narcissism in a way that weren't entirely true. And so what I want to do today is kind of scratch the surface of that, because as I said, my friends, this topic is huge. It is huge. I'm sitting here right now while I'm talking to you with 6 different research articles about narcissism in front of me, and I picked these 6 out of about 50 that I found. And they all have little bits and pieces of information that I'm wanting to pull from them and talk to you all about today. But there was just so much information online. And my friends, if you don't know anything about psychology and diagnostic criteria, and you're just Googling about narcissism, you're going to come up with a bunch of BS. And so that's kind of what I want to dig through today and kind of offer some clarity, some insight, and to kind of break through some of the myths surrounding narcissism. And one of the ways in which I want to kind of break through some myths surrounding narcissism is to look at self-esteem and narcissism, because I think this is the biggest area in which narcissism is very misunderstood. And what I mean by that is that when I hear people talking about narcissism, people that really don't know much about psychology, they're just on social media, reading articles about narcissism, hearing pop culture talking about narcissism, running into narcissistic people, which, by the way, is very common. I think a lot of us don't realize how frequently we run into narcissistic people, because I think the majority of us are struggling with narcissism in our own ways. But as I said earlier, that doesn't mean that I think the majority of us have narcissistic personality disorder, but we're going to talk about that. But one of the ways in which I see narcissism being thrown around in a very unhealthy way is its association with self-esteem. This is kind of where I want to start looking at narcissism. And I'm going to be like pulling some of these articles up that I read through, and kind of, I have highlighted parts here, and I'm going to just kind of talk through this with you guys. Okay, so when it comes to narcissism and self-esteem, most people associate self-esteem and narcissism as having a sort of a positive correlation. that someone that has a lot of self-esteem is going to be narcissistic, or an overly developed sense of self-esteem is going to be narcissistic. And this isn't entirely wrong, but it's also entirely wrong. Let me explain. Okay, so when we say someone has an overly developed sense of self-esteem, that they're narcissistic, how this is not entirely wrong is that there is an aspect of narcissism that deals with self-esteem. And that people that struggle with narcissism focus a lot on their self-esteem, but in a very unhealthy way. And what I want to explain is that there is a difference between having a healthy self-esteem and the way that when we start looking into narcissism, how it can develop some aspects of self-esteem that get interpreted as being overly developed or too much self-esteem, but what they really are is something that's a bit different. So narcissists are associated with having high self-esteem. And this is partially true because narcissists do have, as I said, they have a highly developed sense of self-esteem. But where it differs from having a healthy self-esteem or a healthy high self-esteem is that with narcissists, their self-esteem is very fragile. So it's a form of self-esteem that is completely dependent on external validation. And there are actually two different types of narcissism. We have vulnerable narcissism and we have grandiose narcissism. And with grandiose narcissism, there is an element of self-deception involved in how a person forms their self-esteem. But the self-esteem in all aspects is very fragile. And I'm going to dive in a little bit more into the difference between vulnerable narcissism and grandiose narcissism a bit later. And how actually people that have vulnerable narcissism, their self-esteem is very different from someone who is dealing with grandiose narcissism. But we'll get to that later. For now, I just want to talk about the difference between having a healthy self-esteem, a healthy high self-esteem, and having a fragile high self-esteem. Because this is where I think a lot of people get confused surrounding the topic of narcissism. So what is self-esteem? So self-esteem is basically like one's own evaluation of your own worth. So how you evaluate your own worth, that is your self-esteem. And it's kind of like how you value yourself and how you can rest on this secure foundation of your value and your worth in life. And when a self-esteem is healthy and high, you're able to do this. But a fragile high self-esteem is very dependent on a need for constant external validation of that self-esteem. So a fragile self-esteem is what distinguishes a person who is struggling with narcissism from a person who has a healthy self-esteem. And so there are some traits that you can notice in a person who has a fragile high self-esteem versus someone who has a healthy high self-esteem. And we're going to look at the healthy version here in a minute. But the ones that you can look at and notice in someone who has a fragile high self-esteem are this. Number one is defensiveness. So someone who is narcissistic or has a narcissistic fixation, they are going to be focused on image preservation, so how they think other people perceive them. And what this means is that if someone were to offer constructive criticism or feedback on a person that has a fragile high self-esteem, or in other words, they are narcissistic, then they will see this as being an attack, and then they will therefore defensively attack in return. And so this comes out a lot as usually verbal defensiveness. And this is one really major indicator of a person that has a high fragile self-esteem, is that they're constantly needing to defend themselves the moment that they feel even the slightest bit of chance that their self-image or their image of how they think other people see them is under attack or might be at risk of changing somehow. So a person who's struggling with narcissism will become very verbally defensive. And what this means is that people around them oftentimes describe dealing with a person who is narcissistic as you're walking on eggshells. Because the moment that you say anything to them, even if it's well-intentioned, and it's just like, hey, I noticed this, and could we maybe look at that, and could we figure out why it is that you do this way, and is there a better way to do it? It's like someone struggling with narcissism can't take that. Because immediately in their mind, they see this as my self-image is, or the image of who I am is at risk right now. And they're going to immediately go onto the defensive and start attacking back. So, a second trait of someone with a fragile high self-esteem is validation seeking. So, what this means is that this person's self-esteem is completely dependent on external factors. And this includes things like praise, compliments, or needing recognition from other people for everything that they do. So in other words, it's not good enough that they helped an old lady across the street. They need to make sure that people see it and that people are like, oh, look at you for doing that. You're such a good person. You're such a kind person. So the act in and of itself isn't enough for them. They need the recognition, the praise, the compliments for it. Whereas a person with a healthy high self-esteem would do it and do the good act, and then they're able to validate themselves for it. Like, I did that because I value this, and therefore I wanted to help this person, and I'm living in my values. So they're able to sort of validate themselves, whereas someone with a fragile high self-esteem needs the external validation. And without this validation, the self-esteem of someone with narcissism, it begins to crumble a little bit. And this will start to trigger the narcissistic person or person with narcissistic tendencies to start seeking out a new source of validation. So if helping old ladies across the street no longer gets them that external validation that they're looking for, then they'll start doing something else that they think people will look highly upon and give them validation for. So validation seeking. Another trait of someone with a high fragile self-esteem is an unwillingness to learn from quote-unquote mistakes, or unwillingness to learn from the results of their actions. So what this means is that this deals with not being able to take constructive feedback, obviously. That is one trait, and this is, again, where this defensiveness comes in. But another way in which this shows up, this sort of this unwillingness to learn from mistakes, is that when a person does something and doesn't get the result that they wanted, they spiral. And they're immediately going to do things to try and seek validation and to seek praise and to seek admiration from other people, because their self-esteem and their ego or their self-image is immediately going to start to crumble when they don't get the result that they wanted from the work that they just did. Okay, so that's another trait. Number 4, the fourth way that we can notice someone who has a fragile high sense of self-esteem is that they have a sense of superiority, dominance, or entitlement. And this differs from a healthy self-esteem. And I think that a lot of people associate a healthy self-esteem with this sense of superiority, dominance, or entitlement, but it's not. A fragile self-esteem is someone who, this will come out in ways of superiority, dominance, and entitlement. So they can't just, regard themselves with high self-esteem. they need to be superior to others in order to feel like they have a good enough sense of self-esteem. They need to display dominance and display entitlement. And they may even act in ways where they feel like they're owed special privileges or special admiration more than other people would who have done similar things to them. Okay, so another interesting... I read in this article about narcissism, and we're going to go on to talk about a healthy self-esteem here in just a second. But I found this to be really interesting, that research is pointing to the fact that narcissism functions like addiction in many ways. In the fact that, number one, they have cravings. So it's this drive to constantly maintain this inflated, grand view of oneself. And this is very similar to having an addiction to, say, like alcohol or any other sort of substance, because when a person is met with disapproval from others, then they will go about trying to fill this craving in other ways. So it's kind of, yeah, this is one way in which narcissism is very similar to an addiction. The second way in which it's similar to an addiction is that there's a tolerance aspect to it. So with narcissism, it's basically like if you've ever taken a medication for a long period of time, you may have noticed like you need more and more of the medication to get the same effect out of it. Narcissism is the same in the fact that one way in which a person may seek to experience validation, after a period of time, that almost becomes not enough for them. And so they will go to even more extreme behaviors to build their self-esteem and to receive the validation that they want to receive. So there's an element of tolerance to it. And a third way in which it's very similar to addiction is that there's a withdrawal. So what this means is that when a person struggling with narcissism experiences this kind of collapse in their self-esteem because no one is validating them, no one is praising them, that they will experience withdrawal symptoms. And some of these symptoms could be like, lashing out at people, or they may also make wild statements about their low sense of self-worth, or they may exhibit behaviors of extreme validation seeking or defensiveness. So there's a withdrawal element to it. So yeah, narcissism kind of, it plays out in a way that has patterns similar to an addiction. And addictions are very volatile, very much like someone who's struggling with narcissism is going to be someone, again, where their self-esteem is very fragile. Whereas what I think people want to shy away from, because of the fact that when you meet someone struggling with narcissism, it appears externally as if they have a high sense of self-esteem. And so I think a lot of people tend to avoid working on their self-esteem. And there are many critics out there about, self-esteem work and wanting to avoid self-esteem work because of this focus on narcissism in our society today, and this people wanting to avoid becoming narcissistic. And so people sort of critique this idea of working on your self-esteem and the importance of self-esteem. And so what I want to talk about now is, what does a healthy self-esteem look like? And maybe once we see that, we can see how working on self-esteem is something that's actually quite the opposite of how narcissism functions. So an author named Nathaniel Branden actually wrote about this, basically called the 6 pillars of self-esteem. And so I want to present those to you today, because I think that these 6 pillars of self-esteem actually kind of, they help a person to understand what genuine self-esteem is versus this narcissistic, fragile self-esteem that's based entirely on external validation and, factors that are beyond a person's control. So one aspect, or one of the pillars of a healthy self-esteem, or cultivating a healthy self-esteem, is the practice of living consciously. So a fragile, high self-esteem is built on living unconsciously. It's based on self-deception, and it's based on ignoring underlying behavior motives and trying to validate yourself at the expense of seeing your truth, your motive behind what it is that you're doing, the fact that you're actually seeking validation for your low self-worth. So when we live consciously, instead, people are able to accept feedback. They're able to look at their motives and become mindful of those motives, and also areas in which a person wants to grow without needing that to be an indicator that their self-image is crumbling and that they therefore need to exhibit characteristics of validation seeking and the narcissistic traits that we see. So a person who lives consciously and practices this pillar of a healthy self-esteem is someone who is able to look at their motives and accept feedback and live in a way that is mindful and consciously choosing responses to situations versus reacting. Reacting out of fear or reacting out of anger, fear of your self-image crumbling or the fact that other people might not be looking at you in the way you want to be looked at. So pillar number 1, practicing living consciously. Pillar number 2 is practicing self-acceptance. And I think this ties into pillar number 1 quite extensively, because when we start to live consciously and we start to understand our motivations behind the behaviors that we're exhibiting, and we start to understand our responsibility in our behaviors and our emotions and our ability to choose our responses to those emotions, then we start to be able to see our true selves. And we are able to practice letting go of this sort of our own worst enemy relationship to ourselves. We can stop resisting ourselves so much. We can start seeing why it is that we're doing what we're doing and having compassion for that versus judging it and trying to resist it and trying to sweep it up under the rug and live in denial. Because when we have that fragile high self-esteem, we have to live in denial of our motives, because the moment that we see our motives, we recognize that the real reason why we're doing everything that we're doing is because we refuse to hold ourselves in a space of worthiness and regard, and we refuse to allow ourselves to have a stable sense of self-esteem. And that scares us, so we deny it, and we don't live in self-acceptance. We can't get to that space where we can see all parts of us, and instead of resisting those parts of us, learn to love them and accept them and choose a conscious way to respond in our lives to those. Which brings us to pillar number 3, which is practicing self-responsibility. And again, if we break apart the word responsibility, it is response and ability. So ability to respond. And what this means is that, we have the external factors, things that are going on around us that are beyond our control. And responsibility means being able to look at those things going on around us and choose a response that aligns with our values and aligns with what we know about ourselves, aligns with our personal boundaries. However, before we're able to do that, we first need to learn to have self-responsibility, which means that we're able to show up in a conscious way for ourselves and make sure that our unmet needs are met in a way that we're being respectful to ourselves, but also to the people around us. But in order to be respectful to the people around us, we have to learn to have that self-responsibility to ourselves. So knowing how to set boundaries, knowing how to understand our emotions, and that how we want to choose a response to them versus reacting to them out of resistance. So that's practicing self-responsibility. So the 4th pillar of a healthy self-esteem is to practice self-assertiveness. And this gets confused, I think. Assertiveness gets confused with aggression. So I want to kind of differentiate between the two. So assertiveness is all about letting people know your needs, communicating them, but also communicating our boundaries and, letting people know when things are not okay, but not doing it in a way where we're blaming and we're being defensive and we're trying to tear other people down in order to let ourselves be known. That's the difference between assertiveness and aggressiveness, is that assertiveness is speaking our truth, but it's not doing it in a way where it's like trying to tear other people down or trying to, use fear and guilt and shame with other people to try and let other people know our needs and try and get them to meet them. So self-assertiveness there's also an aspect of it in which we're not afraid to say, hey, I don't understand this. And I want to understand it. And because I don't understand it, I'm not comfortable right now. And so I would like to have a deeper understanding of this. Maybe you're in a conversation and someone starts talking about something that you're not comfortable with because you don't understand it, and it's making you start to panic or feel angry or upset. So a person with a fragile self-esteem would react to that fear and start telling the other person, how they should be talking and tearing them down, and, maybe telling them that they're a bad person for saying what they said and that they're making you feel uncomfortable. Whereas someone who is self-assertive would say, hey, listen, I'm not entirely comfortable with this conversation right now because I think I don't understand fully all of the aspects of what you're trying to say right now. So either could you help me understand this better, or can I take some time to dive into this and understand this a little bit more, and we can approach this conversation at a later time when I can hear all of this and not be reactive to it. I can instead respond to it in a positive way. So that's the difference between self-assertiveness and aggressiveness. So practicing self-assertiveness is a pillar of a healthy self-esteem. All right. Pillar number 5 is the practice of living purposefully. And again, this is just showing up in a way with that secure self-esteem in which we've made sure that our own needs are met. But then once our own needs are met, we show up in our lives in a way that is also useful for others and helping other people to, have their own healthy self-esteem and supporting each other, showing up in a way in which how we're showing up in life is useful for other people, and we're not just constantly in disagreement with other people or constantly in competition with other people and trying to prove who's better. We're actually showing up in a way where us being who we are and how we behave is helpful to other people around us, but not in a way where it's codependent, or in other words, at our own expenses or at the expense of our own needs. So someone with a low self-esteem or a fragile self-esteem, instead of living purposefully, would lead a life of codependency, in which their sense of purpose is to constantly do things for other people, but to do so at the expense of themselves. So this is not living purposefully. This is living in codependence, because again, it's coming from a need of validation from the other person, and you need that validation so badly that you're doing things for other people at the expense of yourself and your own needs. And it prevents people from developing their own potential, because really what they're doing is constantly just seeking validation from other people and not looking at their own purpose in life in a way that they can show up and cultivate their skills and cultivate the things that they want to learn in life and grow in life in a way that they can serve other people in a way that's not against their own needs. So yeah, the 6th pillar is basically to practice personal integrity, which basically just means living in alignment with your values. And that means that we have to be able to know what our values are, know our self-worth, and to act in a way that's in accordance with that self-worth and that value. And what our values are. And what I mean by that is, so like if I have, for instance, one of my core values is compassion. So I try and act from a space of compassion when I'm in a situation where maybe I feel angry at another person. And I step back and I look at the fact, okay, Seth, compassion is one of your values. So if you're angry at this person, there's obviously a misunderstanding here. There's something that you don't fully know or understand that is not allowing you to be compassionate with this person. So how can you respond to this anger in a way that will allow you to develop more compassion in this situation versus reacting to the anger that you're feeling right now inside? And that's not to say that I'm resisting my anger. I'm still allowing the anger to be there because I want to understand why I have that anger. And that anger is coming from a thought or a belief that I have about this person in front of me that may not be true. And I'm not going to fully get to how that belief might not be true if I don't try to respond with compassion to understand the person in front of me so I can get to the bottom of that misunderstanding and figure out why it is that I'm feeling angry right now and feeling like it's coming from this person instead of me recognizing it's just coming from a belief that I have. So that's a way to, just one example of how I, for instance, would show up in my life living in integrity with my value of compassion. Okay, so what this means is that we can stop worrying about developing our sense of self-esteem. And that we can kind of let go of this fear that if we try and develop our sense of self-esteem that we're going to become a narcissist. Because when we develop a healthy sense of self-esteem, it's completely different than when we have this narcissistic tendency where our self-esteem is completely based in external validation and seeking external praise and approval from other people. When we develop a healthy sense of self-esteem, it's not about that. It's about living in alignment, living in integrity, living with purpose. It's about knowing our value and our worth and knowing that it doesn't have to come at the expense of other people's value or worth. And that is the huge difference between having a healthy and secure sense of self-esteem versus a fragile sense of self-esteem. Okay, so another interesting thing that I ran across in doing my research here is that, most people associate self-esteem and narcissism as being, positively correlated. So as our self-esteem increases, narcissism also increases. So an interesting thing that I read here is that narcissism and self-esteem begin to develop around the age of 7. And so children at this age, we're very heavily dependent on social comparison. So we're constantly looking at our peers and the kids around us, adults around us, and comparing ourselves to other people and using that to determine our worth. And this is where parenting is so important, is because, a parent can influence how a child develops in this stage into either becoming more dependent on that external validation or instead learning to look at that desire for that external validation and to turn it inward and instead be like, hey, it's okay. I know I'm wanting to compare myself to these people around me, but even though I'm different from these people around me, I can still feel good about myself. And I can also feel good about these people around me that are different than me because it doesn't affect my worth and it doesn't affect theirs. So, but here's the interesting thing about self-esteem versus narcissism is that although they both begin to develop at the age of 7, self-esteem is at its lowest in adolescence. So when we're kind of like, late childhood, early teenage years, our self-esteem is very, very low. And then as we develop in life, if we develop self-esteem in a healthy way, it slowly increases and we become more confident in ourselves. We become more confident in our ability to show up in our life with purpose and with value and to help other people in a genuine way. Whereas narcissism, if we develop a healthy sense of self-esteem, peaks in adolescence and gradually starts to decline throughout our lifespan. So it's interesting, if we develop a healthy and stable sense of self-esteem, narcissism actually decreases as we get older, whereas our self-esteem goes up. But what they find is, especially with like vulnerable narcissism, is that as self-esteem decreases as we get older, the narcissism increases. So I found that to be a little bit interesting, how we see them as being positively correlated, self-esteem and narcissism, but actually they're not positively correlated. Which brings me to the next aspect of narcissism that I want to talk about. And we're going to dive into a little bit more of the depths of the DSM, the psychological aspect of narcissism, versus just the things that we see in everyday life. So what I want to talk about first is that there are two different types of narcissism. One they call grandiose narcissism, and the other one they call vulnerable narcissism. So the one that we tend to look at the most when we talk about narcissism, the image that comes to mind would best be correlated with grandiose narcissism. And grandiose narcissism is associated with things like arrogance, superiority, vanity, entitlement, exploiting other people, exhibitionism, and the incessant need for acclaim from others. And interestingly, people with grandiose narcissism, they score very high on self-esteem tests, but they feel very unsatisfied with themselves, which means what that tells me is that these people are able to score very high on self-esteem tests, but it's because it's this very fragile and false sense of self-esteem. So yeah, what I want to say here is that it's interesting when we talk about this grandiose narcissism, there's this sense of superiority that we notice in people with grandiose narcissistic tendencies. And what I want to offer is this. Someone who has a stable and healthy sense of self-esteem is someone who is very agreeable, someone who sees other people in their life and the relationships in their life as something that they want to deepen, that they want to connect with other people. They want to support other people, and they want to see their relationships with other people develop. Whereas with grandiose narcissism, we have this exploitiveness, this superiority complex. And what I want to offer here is, if you really look at this, someone with a superiority complex is not someone who has a healthy sense of self-esteem, because their sense of self-esteem comes from feeling better than other people. Whereas someone with a healthy sense of self-esteem feels good about themselves, but they don't feel superior to other people. They also feel good about the people around them. Whereas people that are suffering from this grandiose narcissism, there's an aspect to grandiose narcissism which is very competitive. It's all about superiority. And we'll talk about that here a little bit more. This kind of admiration and rivalry aspect of grandiose narcissism. But what I want to get clear on right now is that this sort of external appearance of superiority actually comes from a lack of a steady and healthy sense of self-esteem. Because remember, their self-esteem is based entirely in external validation, in admiration from others. So self-esteem is more strongly linked to conscientiousness, to perseverance. And narcissism is more associated with superiority and competing and exploiting other people for their own gain. So this is where narcissism and self-esteem are very different. And as I said, though, it's interesting that people that struggle with grandiose narcissism, they score very high on self-esteem tests, which is why it appears, and this is why we associate narcissism with a high self-esteem, but it's really not the same as having a high self-esteem. Narcissism is, people that are narcissistic experience things like expressing anger, and they're very confrontational in their response. They yell and threaten people with physical or verbal aggression. But in self-esteem, it's all about developing deeper relationships. Narcissism is all about acquiring resources, and they use relationships as kind of like a way to acquire more resources to feel better about themselves. Whereas with self-esteem, it's about relating and feeling closer to other people. It's about regarding yourself and others in your social network highly. Not just so people that struggle with narcissism, they kind of see people in their social network as being competition or being something that's like a threat to their self-esteem. Whereas people with a healthy self-esteem, they see other people in their social network as attractive, as of a high status, as intelligent and likable and kind, and people that they want to connect with. Whereas people that struggle with narcissism see people in their social network as people they're competing with, people that they have to be better than, people that they have to exploit and use the relationships to get things that make them look better. And so this comes out in these very like sort of disagreeable and neurotic behaviors. Okay. So self-esteem is associated with lower levels of anxiety, depression, whereas narcissism is actually associated with the opposite. Also, what's interesting is that narcissism is associated with a lot of externalizing behaviors, such as substance abuses with alcohol and drugs, and antisocial behaviors and aggression. So, yeah, very interesting. And I really want to get clear on this today, how important it is to distinguish here that narcissism does not equal a healthy, high self-esteem. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the person has a low self-esteem. But people with vulnerable narcissism do have a low sense of self-esteem, and we're going to get into that here in a second. But what I want us to notice right here is that people with grandiose narcissism, it appears externally that they have a high self-esteem. And like I said, on self-esteem tests, they will score very highly. But when you get to the bottom of the behavior, it's actually being driven by a very fragile sense of self-esteem. So that self-esteem is actually, it's not self-esteem. It's esteem that's coming from the external. So in that aspect, I actually wouldn't even call it self-esteem. It's like external esteem. And this is why I say that self-esteem and narcissism are two completely different things. And, you know, psychologists will say that it's a fragile sense of self-esteem is what narcissists have. I would even go so far as to say it's not even self-esteem that they have. It's an external esteem. So here's where it gets a little bit different, though, is that when we talk about narcissism, there are actually two forms of narcissism. One is called grandiose narcissism, which we just talked about. And this is where people exhibit these behaviors of grandioseness, and they exhibit characteristics of being extremely egotistical, and very self-absorbed. But there's another side to narcissism, and it's called vulnerable narcissism. And these are people that have a very low self-esteem. And even on self-esteem tests, they will score low on self-esteem. They have a very low regard for themselves. But this shows up in their life in a way in which, because their self-esteem is so low, and they desire to have a higher self-esteem, they try and create that self-esteem through seeking external validation. So it's interesting because when we talk about grandiose versus vulnerable narcissism, they're very different in how they express themselves externally. However, there are some aspects of it that are kind of very much the same. And it's one of the ways in which they are very much the same is this kind of rivalry aspect of it. And so when we look at grandiose narcissism, there is this interesting kind of duality to it. And what I mean by that is that they call it the bright and the dark face of grandiose narcissism. And it's basically where people with grandiose narcissism, they embody two traits that are kind of paradoxical to each other. And they're called narcissistic admiration and narcissistic rivalry. And what this means is that people with grandiose narcissism, in the beginning when you meet them, they seem very, very charming. And then as you get to know them better, this is where people start to see people with grandiose narcissism, their image of them starts to fall apart. And so they get very close to you in the beginning and you let them in. And then later on, you start to feel this kind of like egotistical aspect of them starting to come out. And this is because of this duality between this admiration and rivalry. So people with grandiose narcissism, they want admiration because remember that their high sense of self-esteem is completely based external. So they seek admiration from people, and they'll do this by being very charming in the beginning and being very, they want your approval, and so they'll try and get in, but eventually there's another aspect to their personality called narcissistic rivalry, which comes out. And this is what starts to cause the dimensions of the grandiose fantasizing, the what is the word? The competitiveness, the superiority complexes. When this aspect of their personality starts to come out, it's because of this rivalry side to their personality. And what this means is that they see literally everyone around them as a competition to their self-image, to their self-esteem. And this differs very much from vulnerable narcissism. And the fact that in vulnerable narcissism, there's a self-absorption aspect to it, but it comes from the fact that they have no self-esteem whatsoever. And they see everyone as competition around them, but they don't have a superiority complex. They're instead obsessed with seeking other people's approval and needing the praise and needing the admiration from other people because they want to feel good enough. So it's not that they don't have this aspect to their behavior where it's like superiority, and instead they're more like the people that we see that are very clingy and they're very needy, and they constantly need you to tell them that they did a good job, and they constantly need you to praise them. They constantly need you to give you all of their attention, give them all of your attention, and they constantly need for people to give them rewards and and praises. So I find this to be very interesting, that there are these two different forms of narcissism, and they're very different in how they show up, but at the same time, they have this one trait that is similar, and that's the fact that they have this rivalry aspect to their personality. They see everyone around them as basically being competition, but it's kind of like the way that they're competing is completely different. So with vulnerable narcissism, they're competing for attention so that they can feel good enough. And with the grandiose narcissism, they're competing for praise because they need to feel superior to other people so that they can feel like they're good enough. And it's interesting because with the grandiose aspect of it, the grandiose narcissism, they want to feel superior to other people so that they can quote unquote feel good enough, but they don't ever feel good enough. They feel better than other people, but they still don't feel good enough. And I find that to be very interesting because again, we associate narcissism with having a high sense of self-esteem, but people even with grandiose narcissism, they don't feel good enough, which is why they're constantly trying to be better than other people to try and prove their worthiness. So yeah. These are the things, the biggest myths that I wanted to get to today and that I want us to begin to understand is that, first of all, narcissism has two different faces. And the one that kind of gets overlooked is the form of narcissism that is the vulnerable narcissism. What's interesting is that the vulnerable narcissism is easier to clinically diagnose. But it's harder for us as a society to see it because we associate narcissism with having a high sense of self-esteem. Whereas with vulnerable narcissism, these people have a very low sense of self-esteem. But because of that, they are completely self-absorbed because it's all about them and they need approval and they need validation and they need to feel better about themselves and they need everyone else to help them do that. So while their behavior does come across as very self-absorbed, it feels very different than someone with grandiose narcissism who's constantly trying to prove that they're better than other people. People with vulnerable narcissism are constantly needing you to praise them so that they can feel good enough. And that's very draining on people in relationships. And people with vulnerable narcissism, because they have such a low sense of self-esteem, they're not allowed to offer that same validation to other people. They constantly want validation from you, but they can't give it to other people because they feel like they're in competition with you. So this is how narcissism shows up with someone with vulnerable narcissism is that, and why it's difficult in relationships, is that they will constantly want you to praise them, constantly want you to tell them how good they are, but they can't offer the same to you. And so in this way, we can kind of see how this person seems self-absorbed, but it might take a little bit longer for you to recognize it. Grandiose narcissism, on the other hand, I think maybe we start to recognize it a bit quicker because we recognize that superiority, that drive to constantly need to be better than other people, that aggressiveness, that very overt, extroverted defensiveness. Whereas with vulnerable narcissism, they're not so extroverted. They're a lot more introverted and quiet, but then when you do get to know them, you feel this constant pull for you to need to give to them, but they don't give anything back because they can't. They see you as competition, and so if they give you something back, it comes at their expense. So, the key takeaways I want you to take today, my friends, and I could go on and on about this for forever. Narcissism, there's so much more to talk about here. But I gave you the highlights. So the key takeaways that I want you to understand is that, number one, there are two different forms of narcissism. And recognizing the difference between the two and where they come from is going to help us in learning how to approach people that are struggling with narcissism. Attacking people with narcissism, it's not a solution, because all you're doing is feeding into their battle. You're deepening the wound of their fragile or low self-esteem and causing them to just seek more of that external validation. So attacking someone back that's struggling with narcissism, it's not going to get you far with them, my friends. But also seeing them as evil people that are just full of themselves, that need to be taken down a peg or taken down a notch and need to be shown a lesson about how little they are, that's also not going to help a person that's struggling with narcissism to deal with their narcissism. But at the same time, us offering them constant external validation and offering this culture where we teach them that external validation is what we need in order to feel validated feeds into this insecurity. So that's one thing that I want you all to take away from this. Number two is that just because a person is not diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder does not mean that they can't be struggling with narcissism in a serious way. And also, someone struggling with narcissism in a serious way does not necessarily mean that someone has narcissistic personality disorder. So that's another key takeaway that I want you all to take away today, is that narcissism and narcissistic personality disorder are two different things. One requires a clinical diagnosis. And then the other aspect of this is that self-esteem and narcissism are not positively correlated. In other words, having a high and healthy sense of self-esteem does not mean that you will become narcissistic. And that if you feel like you have some narcissistic tendencies, it isn't because of your self-esteem being too high. It's more than likely because your self-esteem is either A, too low and non-developed, or it's fragile. It's completely dependent on external validation. It may be high, but it might be completely dependent on external validation, which brings me to the last thing I want you all to take away today. Even with vulnerable narcissism, their low sense of self-esteem is attached to external validation. And with grandiose narcissism, it's fragile because it's attached to external validation. My friends, we cannot attach our self-esteem to external validation because that is beyond our control. And this is something that goes into so many other aspects of what I teach as a coach. But if you can take this and just really start to wrap your brain around this, when we attach our self-esteem to external validation, we are attaching something that is supposed to be ours to develop in a healthy way to something that is beyond our control. And we are such an externally focused and result-focused society that I think many of us have begun to attach our self-esteem to that external validation, which is why I would say close to 80% of the people on this planet are struggling with narcissism and don't recognize it. And the reason why they don't recognize it is because a lot of the people struggling with narcissism are struggling with the vulnerable narcissism, where they have such a low sense of self-esteem. And so therefore they don't think they're narcissistic because they think so little of themselves. But my friends, that's not the definition of narcissism. Okay? So I need you to really look at that. Really pay attention to your self-esteem. Where is it coming from? And is it low or is it high? If it's high, do you find it to be very fragile and dependent on what other people think of you or what you think other people think of you? Are you constantly seeking validation, praise, or attention on either social media or from other people to keep that sense of self-esteem as high as it is? If so, my friends, that is a narcissistic or fragile sense of self-esteem, and it is something you're going to want to look at because it leads to so many other destructive behaviors, and it will make it difficult for you to have healthy and positive relationships with other people, because all of your relationships with other people are going to be based in manipulating other people to keep your high sense of self-esteem, to keep your grandiose sense of self-esteem. Or if you're someone with a vulnerable narcissistic tendency, then all of your relationships are going to be based in needing people to try and build your self-esteem for you. But in both cases, your self-esteem is based in something external. And when we base something that is our responsibility, something that within us we are able to create, something that we have the power to create, and only we have the power to create, when we delegate that to something external, such as validation, that is something that is beyond our control, that's when we start seeing suffering coming in. That's when narcissism starts to become rampant in your life and starts to create the suffering that we see today in the world, with all of these people on social media and in person just constantly needing more validation, needing more people to tell them how good they are and how much they're loved, because they refuse to see it for themselves, because they refuse to believe that they can give that to themselves and that they can maintain it for themselves and show up in a way where they can see other people as not competition, but as other human beings, that we are here to support each other, to offer each other our services, to offer each other purpose, to offer each other help, but not at the expense of ourself. Not at the expense of ourself and our own needs being met. Not at the expense of our self-esteem. But that also building our self-esteem does not mean that we're doing it at the expense of other people. And that building a sense of self-esteem does not mean that we are superior to other people. It means we regard ourselves in a very high and healthy way, but we also regard the people around us in a very high and healthy way. So, I'm hoping this cleared up a little bit for you all surrounding narcissism and how it shows up in people's lives, some of the misunderstanding around it, some of the controversy around it. I don't think that my conversation here with narcissism is over with this podcast. I feel like this may open up some questions for some of you. So I encourage you to please comment, contact me, and I would love to do another episode on this and talk more in depth in the areas in which you guys have questions, you guys have concerns dealing with narcissism, because I feel like this is an issue in the 21st century that so many of us are dealing with and not talking about, mainly because we misunderstand narcissism, so we can't have a healthy conversation about it without blaming and shaming and guilting people, or without going into avoidance and aggression tactics. So I would like to open up this conversation. I hope this podcast begins to do that for you all. If some of this hit home with you and you start to notice some of the things that I said are things that you're struggling with, reach out for help, my friends. I'm here to help. I'm here to offer you my help. And I don't want you to think that you're alone, or that I think that someone's struggling, that I don't have my own ways in which I struggle with narcissism. Trust me, the reason why I relate so deeply with this topic of narcissism is because I recognize the patterns in my own life with narcissism, and how my low sense of self-esteem led to me seeking external validation to build that self-esteem. And then once I had a sense of self-esteem, I thought that it meant that I needed to be better than other people to maintain that self-esteem, and that I needed to constantly put other people down in order to feel good enough about myself, to have a sense of self-esteem. So my friends, I know what it's like to struggle with that. I do, in the deepest way. I promise you I do, and I'm not going to judge you for it. I feel you, and I know it's tough. I know it's hard to look at. Sometimes it's ugly to look at, but we don't have to look at it as being ugly. It's something that more people are struggling with than you probably realize. And it's not something we have to judge ourselves for. It's something we do have the responsibility to look at and start to untangle, though. So reach out and get help. If you notice that some of the things I talked about today are things you're struggling with, reach out for help. I'm here to help you. Ask your questions. Ask your questions about narcissism, because, my friends, I would love to know what questions I opened up for you with what I talked about today. What things are you disagreeing with? What things are you struggling with wrapping your head around here? What things did I say today that are bumping up against something that you're wanting to resist? Tell me. I would love to open up this conversation more, and let's get clearer on it. I want to make narcissism something that we can openly discuss and take away its power. I don't want narcissism to have its power over us. We have power over narcissism, my friends. And it's nothing to be ashamed of. So let's open up the conversation. Ask me your questions. Give me your thoughts and comments. You can contact me on Instagram. Leave me your thoughts and comments. I'm going to be putting posts up all week about narcissism on my Instagram and Facebook. So you can go there and leave me your comments there. Mention the podcast. You can comment on the podcast on whatever listening platform you're listening in on, and let me know what questions you have, what thoughts you have, what reservations you have, what resistance you have. Or you can contact me via email or on my website, and let me know how I can help you all more, assist you more, support you more in uncovering this mystery of narcissism that we're all dealing with, that we're all sort of struggling to understand. Okay, so that's all I have for you all today. I hope this was insightful. I hope it was helpful. And I'm going to leave you all to enjoy the rest of your week. And I hope to hear from you all. I'll talk to you again soon. Ciao. Hey, thank you for listening in this week. I hope you enjoyed the content of this episode. If you did, please subscribe or follow this podcast to receive the newest episodes every week as I bring them to you here on the Connect Your Health to Life coaching channel. Ratings, reviews, and comments are always appreciated. These allow me to know more of what my listeners would like in the podcast, and allow for more people who may be searching for a podcast just like this one to find the Connect Your Health to Life coaching channel. If you would like more information about me and the work that I do with my clients one-on-one, then please visit my website at www.slch.ch. Again, that is www.slch.ch. You can also find me on social media on Instagram at SethLusk_coaching. Again, that is SethLusk_coaching. And on Facebook in my free Facebook group community called A Healthy Life Connection. We would love to have you in the group, and it's only 3 membership questions that you have to answer to join. And again, it's entirely free. And if you need any further information or just want to say hello, feel free to send me an email directly at slusk.health@slch.ch. Again, that is slusk.health@slch.ch. Thank you again so much for listening, and I look forward to our next time together. Ciao.